I'd driven that same route for 3 years straight. But one night, my GPS took me somewhere that doesn't exist on any map. And I'm still not sure what was sitting in my back seat when I finally got home. My name's Jason. I drive for a regional delivery company out of a warehouse just off I-70, somewhere between Columbus and the middle of nowhere, Ohio. Night shift, mostly rural routes, the kind where you go 20-30 minutes without seeing another set of headlights. I'd been doing it for almost 3 years by then. I could have driven my route home with my eyes closed. It was late October, a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were always slow, and that night I clocked out early, around 11:30 p.m. It had been raining on and off all evening, that thin, cold rain that makes the road look like black glass under your headlights. I got in my truck, plugged in my phone, and let Google Maps do its thing like I did every single night. Not because I needed directions, just habit. About 10 minutes in, the GPS told me to turn left at an intersection I didn't recognize. I actually laughed a little. I'd taken that exact road probably 500 times. There was no left turn there, just a straightaway that ran another 2 miles before you even hit the turnoff for my neighborhood. I glanced down at the screen. The blue line was right there, clean, confident, no error message, no rerouting. It just showed a road that, as far as I knew, didn't exist. I figured maybe there'd been construction, some new county road I hadn't heard about. So I took the turn. The second I did, something felt wrong. No houses, no mailboxes, no power lines running along the shoulder like every other back road out here. Just trees, tall, black, packed in tight on both sides like a wall closing in on the road. My phone signal dropped from 3 bars to 1, then to nothing but an SOS only notice in the corner. I pushed my brights on. Still nothing but cracked asphalt stretching out ahead of me, further than my headlights could reach. The GPS kept ticking along like normal. 4 minutes to destination. I remember that specifically because 4 minutes came and went, and it still said 4 minutes. I checked the clock on my dash. 11:52 p.m. I looked back up at the road, then back down. Still 11:52. That's when the cold feeling really set in. The kind you get in your stomach before your brain even knows why. I eased off the gas, thinking about just turning around, backing up, whatever it took to get off that road. That's when my headlights caught something on the shoulder. An old sign, rusted through, leaning slightly to one side like it had been there for decades. It didn't have a road name on it. Just one line, spray painted in what looked like fresh white paint, dripping slightly at the edges. Don't check your mirror. My hands were shaking on the wheel at that point. I told myself I wasn't going to look. I remember actually saying it out loud in the truck. Don't look, don't look. Like that was going to help. But there's something about being told not to do something that makes your body do it anyway. My eyes flicked up to the rearview mirror before I could stop myself. The back seat of my truck, which I knew for a fact was empty, because I'd tossed my lunch cooler back there myself before my shift, had someone sitting in it. Not moving, not turning toward me. And where the face should have been, there was just nothing, like the shape of a person with the details erased. I don't remember deciding to scream. I just remember hearing myself do it, and slamming on the brakes hard enough that my seatbelt locked up across my chest. The truck skidded to a stop in the middle of that empty road. When I forced myself to turn around and look directly at the back seat, there was nobody there. Just my cooler, sitting exactly where I'd left it. My phone screen went black right after that. Not dimmed, completely dead like the battery had died, except it had been at 80% a minute earlier. When it powered back on by itself about 10 seconds later, Maps was just running normally again. No weird road, no 4-minute countdown stuck on repeat. And somehow, I was parked right at the entrance to my own subdivision. 20 minutes from the warehouse, exactly like always. I never found that road again. I've looked for it in daylight, driven that same stretch a dozen times since. Checked satellite view online more than I'd like to admit. There's nothing there. No turnoff, no old sign, nothing but the tree line running straight along the highway like it always has. I still work nights. I still use GPS because old habits die hard, I guess. But there's one thing I don't do anymore. Not ever. Not even when I think I hear something shift behind me on a long stretch of empty road. I don't check the mirror. Because I'm not sure, next time, the back seat would actually be empty. I took over the night shift at that warehouse because the guy before me disappeared without a trace. 3 weeks in, I understood exactly why he never came back for his last paycheck. My name's Derek. I'm 34. And back in 2022, I was between jobs after a layoff, taking whatever I could get. A staffing agency placed me at a distribution warehouse just outside Louisville, Kentucky. A massive building, the kind that stores furniture and appliances before they get shipped out to stores across 3 states. Night shift security, midnight to 8 a.m. Mostly just walking the floor with a flashlight and a radio, checking that the loading dock doors were locked, making sure nobody was where they shouldn't be. The job paid decent for what it was, and the site manager who hired me, a guy named Frank, was upfront about one thing during my interview. The previous guard, a man named Gary, had quit without notice. Just stopped showing up one Tuesday night, and nobody from the company had heard from him since. Frank made it sound like nothing unusual. "Happens more than you'd think in this line of work," he said. "People just walk off jobs sometimes." I didn't think much of it. I needed the paycheck. The warehouse itself was enormous. Rows of steel shelving 3 stories high, stretching back so far that the far end of the building disappeared into shadow, even with the overhead lights on. Only about 1/3 of the lights actually worked at night, something about the electrical system being scheduled for an upgrade that kept getting pushed back. My first 2 weeks were uneventful, quiet, honestly boring. Just me, my flashlight, and a lot of empty aisles. It was during my 3rd week, around 3 a.m., when I first noticed something odd on my usual patrol route. Section G, in the back 1/3 of the warehouse, was almost entirely unlit. 2 of the 3 light fixtures back there had been out since before I started. I always kept my flashlight up when I walked through, more out of habit than actual concern. That night, my flashlight beam caught something at the far end of the aisle. A security badge lying flat on the concrete floor. I picked it up, expecting maybe a torn strap or something a coworker had dropped. It was Gary's badge. The guy who'd quit without notice, months before I'd even started. I remember standing there for a second, badge in hand, doing the math. Why would his badge still be on the floor, months later, in a warehouse that got swept and inventoried regularly? I put it in my pocket, figuring I'd hand it to Frank in the morning, and kept walking. I told Frank about the badge the next morning. He got quiet for a second, longer than felt normal, before saying he'd take care of it, and that was the end of the conversation. I didn't think much of it at the time, just chalked it up to him being tired, or maybe a little embarrassed that a badge had gone unnoticed on the floor for that long. 2 nights later, my radio crackled with static while I was walking through Section G again, right around the same spot I'd found the badge. Nothing unusual about that. The radios were old, and dead zones weren't uncommon in a building that size. But right before it cut out completely, I could have sworn I heard a voice come through, low, distorted, saying something that sounded like, "Still here." I called out on the radio to dispatch, asking if anyone had tried to reach me. Nobody had. I started paying more attention after that. Small things. A shelving unit in Section G that I was certain I'd left with boxes stacked neatly, found the next night with boxes shifted, like someone had gone through them. A cold spot in the air, right around the same aisle, that didn't match anywhere else in the building, even with the warehouse's inconsistent heating. About a week after finding the badge, I decided to look into Gary a little more. I asked around, talked to a couple of the day shift guys who'd overlapped with him before he disappeared. What I learned didn't sit right with me. Gary hadn't quit in any normal sense. According to one of the day shift supervisors, Gary's car had been found still parked in the employee lot for almost 2 full weeks after his last shift, before anyone even reported him missing. Nobody from the company had ever formally filed a police report. Frank had apparently told corporate it wasn't worth the trouble, since Gary was a contract hire and had a history of unreliability. The supervisor said it privately, almost embarrassed to admit the company hadn't done more. That night, walking my usual route, I found myself avoiding Section G entirely for the first time. I told myself it was just being cautious, nothing more. But around 4 a.m., my radio crackled again, the same static as before, and this time I heard it clearer. Not words exactly, just breathing, slow, deliberate, way too close to sound like it was coming through a radio channel from somewhere else in the building. I made the decision to walk into Section G that night instead of avoiding it, telling myself I needed to prove to myself that nothing was actually wrong, that this was just an old building playing tricks on someone working too many night shifts alone. About halfway down the aisle, my flashlight beam caught movement at the far end. Someone standing between 2 rows of shelving, facing away from me. I called out, thinking it might be Frank doing a surprise check, or maybe one of the day shift guys who'd stayed late. The figure didn't turn around. It didn't move at all. I called out again, louder, and started walking closer, my heart pounding hard enough that I could hear it over my own footsteps. When I got within about 20 feet, the figure finally turned. For one terrible second, my flashlight lit up a face I recognized from the employee ID photos still pinned up in the break room. Gary's face, gaunt, pale in a way that didn't look like it belonged to someone alive, eyes fixed directly on mine. Then my flashlight died. Completely. Not flickered, just cut out, plunging that entire section of the warehouse into total darkness. I don't remember running. I just remember being at my car in the parking lot, badge and radio still in my hands, completely out of breath, with no memory of how I'd gotten from Section G to the front doors. I never went back for my final paycheck. I called Frank the next day and quit over the phone, told him I'd found a different job, didn't explain any further, and he didn't ask. I looked up Gary's name a few months later. Out of curiosity, I couldn't quite shake. There was no obituary, no missing persons report on file with the local police, nothing at all. As far as any public record was concerned, Gary simply stopped existing the night he stopped showing up for his shift. I still think about that warehouse sometimes, usually late at night when I'm working alone at my current job. A much smaller building with lights that actually work in every corner. I think about Gary's badge, still sitting in a drawer in my apartment, because I never did figure out who to give it back to. And sometimes, when my radio picks up static for no reason, I still wonder if somewhere in that warehouse, in Section G, past where the lights stop working, someone is still walking that route, still doing the job nobody ever officially let him leave. I've been hiking alone since I was 19 years old, and I never once felt unsafe out there. until the night something followed me off the trail, into my car, and, as far as I can tell, all the way home. My name's Amanda. I'm 28, and hiking's basically been my thing since college. Nothing extreme, mostly day hikes. A few overnights when I could get the time off. Last October, I drove out to a trailhead in the Blue Ridge Mountains in western North Carolina, a spot I'd hiked probably a dozen times before. It's popular during the day, but I like getting there early, before the crowds. And this particular trip I'd planned to do a longer loop, about 9 miles, aiming to be back at my car well before dark. Everything started out completely normal. Cool morning, clear skies, maybe 6 other cars in the trailhead lot when I parked around 7 a.m. I signed the trail register like I always do. Not out of any real caution, just habit. And started up the loop. The hike itself was uneventful for most of the day. I passed a handful of other hikers heading the opposite direction, stopped for lunch at an overlook around noon, and started making my way back down toward the trailhead in the early afternoon, figuring I'd be back at my car with plenty of daylight to spare. About 2 miles from the trailhead, on a stretch of trail that ran close along a ridgeline with a steep drop-off on one side, I first got the feeling I wasn't alone. Nothing concrete? Just that prickling sensation on the back of your neck, the kind hikers talk about, the one that usually turns out to be nothing. I stopped and looked around. No one on the trail behind me, no one visible ahead. I chalked it up to being tired, maybe a little dehydrated after 9 miles, and kept walking. About 10 minutes later, I heard something moving through the underbrush off to my left, parallel to the trail, matching my pace almost exactly. I stopped again. The movement stopped too. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe a black bear keeping its distance. Nothing unusual for that part of the mountains. I kept my bear spray in hand for the rest of the descent, just in case, and picked up my pace slightly. The feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got stronger the closer I got to the trailhead. At one point, I stopped completely and just listened. And I distinctly heard footsteps, not an animal's gait, but something walking upright, on 2 legs, stepping deliberately through the leaves, maybe 30 feet off the trail, staying just out of sight behind the tree line. I called out, thinking maybe it was another hiker who'd gotten turned around off trail. Nobody answered. The footsteps stopped the second I called out, then started again a few seconds later once I resumed walking. By the time I reached the trailhead parking lot, it was almost empty, just my car and 1 other vehicle left, the light starting to fade into early evening. I practically ran the last 100 yards to my car, threw my pack in the back seat, and locked the doors the second I was inside. I sat there for a minute, catching my breath, telling myself I'd let my imagination get the better of me after a long day alone in the woods. I started the engine and pulled out of the lot, heading down the long gravel access road that led back to the highway, forest pressing close on both sides. About halfway down that road, my headlights caught something standing just at the edge of the trees, tall, still, watching my car pass. I only got a glimpse before it was behind me, but it didn't look right. Too thin, too tall to be a person standing normally. Its head tilted at an angle that made my stomach drop. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I just kept my eyes on the road ahead and drove, telling myself I'd imagined it. That the light was playing tricks, that I was exhausted and spooked and seeing things that weren't there. About 20 minutes into the 2-hour drive home, on a dark stretch of 2-lane highway with no other cars in sight, I heard a soft thump come from the back of my car, like something shifting in my trunk. I gripped the wheel and told myself it was just my hiking gear settling, or a water bottle that had rolled loose. But then I heard it again, closer this time. and it didn't sound like it was coming from the trunk at all. It sounded like it was coming from directly behind my seat, inside the cabin of the car. I couldn't bring myself to look in the rearview mirror. I kept my eyes locked on the road, both hands white-knuckled on the wheel, driving faster than I should have on that dark highway, telling myself I just needed to get to the next gas station, just needed people around, just needed light. When I finally pulled into a gas station about 10 minutes later, brightly lit, a couple other cars at the pumps, I sat frozen for a moment before forcing myself to turn around and look at the back seat. It was empty, completely empty, exactly like it should have been. My pack was still sitting where I'd thrown it, nothing disturbed, nothing out of place. I got out, hands shaking, and checked my trunk too, fully expecting to find nothing there either. Instead, I found long, deep scratch marks across the inside of the trunk lid. 4 parallel lines, like something with claws had been trying to get out from the inside. I called a friend to come meet me at that gas station rather than finishing the drive alone, and I haven't looked at my car the same way since. I got the trunk repainted a few weeks later, but I still catch myself glancing at those scratch marks in my memory every time I load my hiking gear in. I posted about it in a local hiking group online afterward, mostly just to see if anyone else had experienced something similar on that same trail. A few people responded with their own stories. Nothing identical, but enough vague, uneasy accounts of something in the trees near that same ridgeline that I stopped feeling quite so alone in what happened, even if it didn't make me feel any better. I still hike. I don't think I could give it up even if I wanted to, but I don't hike that particular trail anymore. And I never, ever leave my trunk unlocked when I park at a trailhead, no matter how empty the lot looks. And every time I drive home, alone after a hike, somewhere in the back of my mind, I'm listening for that thump again, waiting to hear if something decided to follow me home a second time. I work the drive-through window at a coffee shop off a highway exit in rural Pennsylvania. Most nights, I don't even remember the customers' faces, but I will never forget the woman who pulled up to my window and said my name before I'd said a single word to her. My name's Casey. I'm 22. I go to community college during the day, and I work the night shift at a coffee place attached to a gas station. The kind that stays open till 2 a.m. for truckers and people driving through on their way to somewhere else. I'd been working there almost a year at that point. Nothing ever really happened. Same regulars, same tired truckers, same half-asleep conversations through a drive-through speaker. It was a Thursday night in November, cold enough that frost had already started forming on the inside of the window by 11 p.m. Business was dead. I hadn't had a car come through in almost 40 minutes when the bell on the speaker dinged. I leaned into the mic and said the usual line. "Welcome. What can I get started for you tonight?" There was a pause. Then a woman's voice, calm, almost pleasant, said, "Hi, Casey. I'll have a small black coffee." I froze for a second. My name tag was pinned to my apron, sure, but it was dark outside. Her car hadn't even pulled up to the window yet. And my name tag definitely wasn't visible from the speaker box that far back in the lot. I told myself she must have just glanced at something, some coincidence, and I brushed it off. I made her coffee and waited for her car to roll up. When she finally pulled up, I saw her clearly for the first time. Older woman, maybe 60s, wearing a plain gray coat, sitting very still behind the wheel of an old sedan I didn't recognize. No plates that I could see, or maybe I just didn't think to check at the time. I handed her the coffee, and she looked at me. Not at the cup, not at the register, right at my face, and said, "You should take the back roads home tonight, Casey, not the highway." I hadn't told her I drove home on the highway. I hadn't told her my shift was ending soon. She hadn't asked. She just knew. I laughed it off, said something like, "Oh, okay, thanks," the way you do when you don't know what else to say. She smiled, took her coffee, and drove off into the dark without another word. I couldn't stop thinking about it for the rest of my shift. When 2 a.m. finally hit, I clocked out, got in my car, and sat in the parking lot for a solid minute, arguing with myself about whether to actually listen to a stranger's advice. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was the way she'd said my name. So easy, so certain, like she'd known me my whole life. I took the back roads. About 15 minutes into that drive, I passed the entrance ramp to the highway, the one I would have taken if I hadn't listened to her. There were police lights everywhere, flares laid out across both lanes, an ambulance parked sideways, blocking traffic completely. I didn't stop to find out what happened. I just kept driving, my hands shaking on the wheel the whole way home. The next morning, I looked up the local news. Hands still a little unsteady from the night before. There'd been a bad accident on that stretch of highway around 1:50 a.m., right around the time I would have been driving through it if I'd taken my normal route. Multiple vehicles involved. The article didn't say much else, just that emergency crews had closed the road for hours. I went back to work 2 nights later, half hoping and half dreading that the woman would come through again. I wanted to ask her how she knew my name, how she knew which road I usually took, how she knew to warn me at all. She never came back. Not that night, not the night after, not once in the 8 more months I worked there before I quit for a different job closer to campus. I asked my coworkers if they remembered her. Gray coat, older woman, sedan with no visible plates. Nobody did. I checked the security camera footage from that night, thinking maybe I could at least get a clearer look at her car, maybe find something that would explain it. The footage from the drive-through lane that night is just static for the 4 minutes she was there. Before and after, it's completely clear. Just those 4 minutes, gone. I still work nights sometimes. Different job now, different town. And every so often, when a car pulls up that I can't quite make out in the dark, some small, stupid part of me still hopes it's her. Not because I'm scared anymore. Because I never got to ask the one thing I actually wanted to know. How did she know to save my life? And what would have happened if I hadn't listened? The listing said the whole house was ours for the weekend, private entrance, host lives off-site. By the second night, I was certain someone was still living there with us. My name's Kelly. Last summer, my sister Megan and I booked a long weekend trip out to the Finger Lakes region in upstate New York, mostly for wine tasting and a break from work. We found a place on Airbnb, an older farmhouse converted into a rental, sitting a few miles outside a small town surrounded by vineyards. The listing had great reviews, all 5 stars, people raving about the charm of the place and how quiet and private it felt. The description specifically said the owner lived nearby but not on the property, and that we'd have the entire house to ourselves. There was a small locked door in a hallway off the kitchen that the listing mentioned as owner's storage, not part of the rental, which seemed normal enough. Plenty of Airbnbs have a closet or room the host keeps locked for their own belongings. We checked in Friday evening using a lockbox code the host, a woman named Diane, had texted us. The house was beautiful. Exposed wood beams, an old stone fireplace, exactly like the photos. Diane had left a handwritten welcome note on the kitchen counter, along with a bottle of local wine, which felt like a nice touch. Everything about that first night felt completely normal. It was around 1 a.m. that first night when I got up for a glass of water and noticed a thin line of light coming from underneath that locked storage door in the hallway. I stood there for a second, confused, since the listing had been clear that door led to a space that wasn't part of our rental and that the host didn't stay on the property. I figured maybe it was just a light Diane had left on by accident, or some kind of motion sensor light inside triggered by something. I went back to bed and didn't think much more about it. The next morning, I mentioned it to Megan, half joking that maybe our host had a secret room. She laughed it off too. We spent the day out at Vineyards, had a great time, came back that evening tired and ready to relax for our second night. That second night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to what sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere inside the house. Not outside, not upstairs where our bedrooms were, but from that same hallway near the locked door. I lay there for a while, telling myself it was probably just the house settling. Old farmhouses make all kinds of strange noises. But the footsteps didn't have that random, structural quality. They sounded like someone walking back and forth in a small space, pacing. I nudged Megan awake, and we both listened together for a few minutes. She heard it too, which somehow made it both less scary and more real at the same time. I wasn't imagining it. But now we both had to deal with the fact that something was making that noise. We worked up the nerve to peek into the hallway. The light under the locked door was on again, same thin line at the bottom, and the pacing sound was definitely coming from directly behind it. Neither of us wanted to knock on a stranger's locked storage door at 3 in the morning, so we went back to bed, though neither of us slept much after that. In the morning, over coffee, we decided to just ask Diane about it directly when she came by later that day to drop off some fresh towels, which she'd mentioned she'd do. When Diane arrived around noon, I brought it up as casually as I could, mentioning we'd heard some noise from that locked room the night before, half expecting her to laugh it off and mention a fan or an old radiator. Instead, her expression changed almost instantly. She got quiet, glanced toward the hallway, and then told us, a little too calmly, that the room was just storage. Nothing in there that could make noise, and that we'd probably just heard the house settling like older homes do. But her hands were fidgeting with the towels the entire time she said it, and she left pretty abruptly after that, much sooner than her usual visits, according to what she'd told us the day before. That night, the third and final night of our stay, the footsteps started again around the same time. But this time, they didn't stay confined to that hallway. We heard them moving, slow and steady, coming closer to the guest bedroom door where Megan and I were both now sleeping in the same bed, too unnerved to be in separate rooms. The footsteps stopped directly outside our bedroom door. We both went completely still, barely breathing, staring at the thin gap of darkness under the door. Then we heard breathing, slow, deliberate, close enough that whoever or whatever was making that sound had to be standing right there, inches away from us. The doorknob turned, slowly all the way, then stopped, like whoever was on the other side had found it locked and paused to consider what to do next. Megan grabbed my hand so hard it hurt. Neither of us said a word. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds, the footsteps retreated, moving back down the hallway toward that same locked storage room. And then everything went quiet. We didn't sleep at all after that. The second the sun came up, we packed our bags and left almost 2 hours before our official checkout time, leaving the key in the lockbox, not bothering to wait around for Diane. When I got home, I looked up the property out of curiosity, digging through old real estate records for the address. What I found didn't sit right with me. The house had been in Diane's family for decades, and before it was ever listed on Airbnb, it had been her mother's full-time residence. An elderly woman who, according to a local obituary I found from a few years back, had passed away in that house. I never found any information suggesting the mother had died anywhere near that hallway or that storage room specifically. But I also couldn't shake the timing of it all, or the way Diane's whole demeanor had changed the moment we mentioned the noises. I left a review mentioning the strange footsteps as gently as I could, mostly just to see if any other guests had experienced something similar. Diane never responded publicly, but within a day, the entire listing had been taken down from Airbnb completely, without explanation. I still think about that locked door sometimes, and the sound of that doorknob slowly turning in the dark. Megan and I don't really talk about it anymore, not because we've forgotten, but because neither of us has ever come up with an explanation that makes it easier to think about. We still travel together every year, but now, before booking anywhere, both of us always check for one thing first: whether the listing mentions any room in the house we won't be allowed into. We'd lived in that house for 6 years before I ever went looking behind the wall in our basement. I wish, more than anything, that I'd just left it alone. My name's Rebecca. My husband Tom and I bought our house back in 2019, an old farmhouse-style place outside a small town in upstate New York, built sometime in the 1940s. The kind with thick stone foundations and a basement that always smelled faintly of damp earth, no matter how many dehumidifiers we ran down there. We used the basement mostly for storage. Christmas decorations, old furniture we couldn't part with, boxes of stuff from both our childhoods that neither of us had the heart to throw away. It wasn't finished. Bare concrete floor, exposed beams, one bare bulb hanging from the ceiling that you had to pull a string to turn on. Not exactly cozy, but it did the job. Every house that old comes with its quirks. Ours had a section of the basement wall, toward the back corner, that was clearly patched at some point. Different concrete, slightly darker, like someone had filled in a hole or a doorway a long time before we ever moved in. Tom used to joke about it. Probably an old coal chute, he'd say, or a root cellar they sealed off. We never thought much of it. It was just part of the house's history, like the crack in the kitchen tile or the door that didn't quite close right upstairs. That changed in February of last year. It started small. I went down to grab a box of winter clothes and noticed a smell I hadn't smelled before. Not the usual basement dampness, but something sweeter. Almost like rotting fruit, except there was no fruit down there. I figured maybe something had died in the walls, a mouse or a squirrel that got in and couldn't get back out. It happens in old houses. I mentioned it to Tom. He agreed it was probably that, and we didn't think much more of it. But the smell didn't go away. If anything, over the next week, it got slightly stronger every time I went down there. And it seemed to be coming specifically from that patched section of wall in the back corner. Tom decided to take a look, thinking he'd find a dead animal caught in some gap behind the drywall. Except there was no drywall there, just the old patched concrete. He tapped on it a few times with the handle of a hammer, listening for a hollow sound. Something that would explain where a smell like that could even be coming from. About a third of the way up the patch, the tapping sounded different. Hollow. Like there was empty space behind it, not solid ground like the rest of the foundation. That alone was strange enough. But what really got under my skin was something else he noticed while he had his ear close to the wall, listening for the hollow spot. He said he heard scratching. Not the quick scurry of a rodent moving around and then stopping. Slow, deliberate scratching, like something dragging across the other side of that concrete. Then stopping for several seconds, then starting again. He straightened up fast and didn't say anything for a second. Then he just said, "We're calling someone about this." We didn't call anyone that week. I wish we had. Instead, life got in the way. Tom's work picked up, my mom got sick, and I spent a few days out of town helping her. And the basement problem got pushed to the back of both our minds the way inconvenient things do. About 10 days after the scratching, I went downstairs alone to grab the vacuum from storage. It was maybe 9 p.m. Dark outside, just me and Tom in the house, him upstairs watching TV. I pulled the string for the bulb, and the second the light came on, I heard it, clear as anything, from that back corner. Not scratching this time. A knock. 3 slow knocks, evenly spaced, like someone rapping their knuckles against the inside of the wall on purpose. I didn't move. I don't think I even breathed for a few seconds. Then, so quiet, I almost convinced myself I imagined it, I heard a voice. Muffled, like it was coming through a thick wall, or through water. I couldn't make out actual words. Just a tone. Low, and it almost sounded like it was trying to sing. I left the vacuum where it was and went straight back upstairs. That was the night we finally called someone. Not the police, not right away, but an old contractor Tom knew who'd worked on foundations for decades in the area. He came out 2 days later, took one look at the patch job, and got quiet in a way that made both of us nervous. He told us the patch wasn't original to the house. Based on the type of concrete and the way it had been poured, he guessed it had been added sometime in the 60s or 70s, decades after the house was originally built. Not a coal chute, not a root cellar. Something had been sealed up back there, on purpose, well after the house was already standing. He wouldn't break through it himself, said that was a job for the county, maybe even the police, depending on what was found. And he strongly recommended we call them before doing anything ourselves. Tom and I stood in that basement staring at that wall for a long time after he left. We called the local police the next morning. 2 officers came out, along with someone from the county building department. It took them most of a day, working carefully, before they finally broke through the old concrete patch. Behind it was a narrow space, barely 3 feet deep, built into what would have originally been part of the old foundation's crawl space. Empty, except for one thing sitting in the very back corner. An old, rusted metal box, the kind with a simple latch, no lock. Nobody would tell us what was found inside it once they opened it. The officers just exchanged a look, and one of them quietly told us this had become an active matter, and that we shouldn't discuss it with anyone else for now. That was almost a year ago. To this day, nobody from the county or the police department has told us anything more. No follow-up call, no explanation, no closure. When Tom tried calling a few months later just to ask if there'd been any update, he was told the case was still open, and that was all they could share. We had that section of the basement wall rebuilt properly, filled in solid this time, no gaps, no hollow spaces. The smell went away almost immediately. So did the scratching. But every so often, usually late at night when the house is quiet, I swear I still hear something coming from that corner. Not scratching anymore, not knocking either. Just that same low, muffled tone, almost like humming, coming from somewhere behind a wall that isn't supposed to be hollow anymore. We haven't gone looking again. And honestly, I don't think we ever will.